So I've played Dune Awakening for about 60 hours, testing many different combinations of graphics settings to try and figure out what they all do and what their relative performance impacts are, and now I'm here to share my findings and recommendations with you. So let's go to the settings and check out the display tab. For field of view, there's only about a 2% performance difference from the min to max value, so you can set this to whatever you want. I'm happy with the default of 90, but you could bump it a little higher if you want to get more expansive vistas or be able to see enemies surrounding you a bit better. Motion blur is particularly bad in this game. You notice it mostly when driving vehicles. It turns the whole screen into a blurry mess. Its quality is affected by the post-processing setting in the graphics tab. At lower levels it looks more grainy, but never mind that because you're probably not going to use it anyway. You can enable VSync if you get screen tearing, but I haven't seen any at all personally. Keeping it off will give you the best input response time. And if you care about getting the best input response, you can keep the frame rate cap at unlimited. For casual solo people though, setting this at 60 is probably a better idea. My system consists of an RTX 3090 Ti, a Ryzen 7 5800X, and 40 gigabytes of RAM. I've mostly gotten between 80 and 90 FPS playing this game, but it's been anywhere from 49 to 149 depending on the area, so you can expect a huge variation depending on conditions, and if you just cap to 60, the swings are going to be much less distracting, and when you do dip below 60, it's not going to feel nearly as bad as if you were dropping all the way from 120 plus. And using a cap will keep your GPU from working overtime and turning your gaming room into a desert. Now for testing purposes, I've done the majority of my playing on a private server. However, I only had to spend about 50 seconds on a public server to get annoyed by someone spamming nonsense in the global text chat. So to prevent those messages from appearing on your screen, you want to set Show Text Chat on HUD to off, if you want. Okay, on to the graphics tab. Full screen and windowed full screen are pretty similar, but full screen seems to perform just a hair better. Both perform significantly better than the windowed mode, so I'd avoid that if possible. There's no reason to set your resolution to anything but your monitor's native resolution, since you're going to be upscaling from a lower resolution anyway. For upscaling, your options in order of preference are DLSS, XESS, TSR, FSR, and TAA. Temporal anti-aliasing isn't really an upscaling method, it's just anti-aliasing. However, you can select it, then set a resolution scale, and the game will just render at that resolution, fill the window without doing any smart upscaling, and anti-alias the result. That looks really terrible though. That's why it's the least preferred option. DLSS is obviously the best. It looks pretty darn good even at the lowest preset, so that's what I use. However, how much performance improvement you get from more aggressive upscaling varies a ton throughout the game. For an intense firefight at a multi-level compound, you're going to feel the difference, but in many of the quieter areas, you'll basically see no improvement at all from using upscaling. But I recommend setting this as low as you can tolerate so you do get the best performance in the areas with more resolution-dependent effects. As long as you're averaging 60 FPS or more, I wouldn't bother with frame generation. It does get automatically enabled as you fiddle with the upscaling quality settings, so watch out for that. Frame generation doesn't improve input response time, so it's sort of at odds with the NVIDIA reflex setting if your card supports it. I don't have the reflexes for this to matter to me, but if you want the best input response time, you'll turn this on at the cost of some GPU and CPU. But you can only turn it on if frame generation is off. So if you want to enable this and you're finding it disabled, make sure you check and make sure that frame generation is off. And then you should be able to turn this setting on. Lighting is where the real performance impact is found. The frame rate difference between low and ultra shadows is around 12%. For GI quality and reflections quality, it's about 4%. So compared to those three settings, basically nothing else matters performance-wise. So when it comes to shadows, the most important consideration is whether or not you use virtual shadow maps. I recommend that you use them if you can. The setting is currently labeled as experimental, but what that means in my experience testing it is that occasionally virtual shadow maps are a bit buggy. I've seen shadows that don't seem properly connected to geometry and shadows that just, sort of suddenly pop in way too late. But those little glitches were very rare. Literally many hours of gameplay apart. The vast majority of the time, virtual shadow maps seem to work perfectly fine, and they are a big improvement over standard cascaded shadow textures. So obviously higher quality always means you see higher resolution shadow textures closer to the camera. But even at the highest quality setting, if you don't use virtual shadow maps, you will see a transition line as you approach shadows. And given how stark and prominent the landscape shadows are on the sandy terrain, you'll see this artifact all the time. And in my opinion, it's a bit distracting. With the virtual shadow maps, you just never see a transition line ever. The shadows are perfectly stable at any distance, and they have a natural fall off where they are sharper near the casting object and fuzzier further away. Virtual shadow maps at the highest quality setting just look ridiculously good. But because the shadow quality setting is the most expensive graphic setting, I actually keep it at low because I'm using virtual shadow maps. Virtual shadow maps at the low setting still look pretty good, even in motion. In fact, I think because of their stability, virtual shadow maps at low look better than traditional maps at the ultra quality setting. Without virtual shadow maps, moving shadows look really terrible at lower quality. So without virtual shadow maps, you're really going to have to decide whether you want better looking shadows or more performance. With virtual shadow maps, you're only paying about 2% in frame rate over traditional cascaded shadow textures. So they're definitely worth the cost if your card can handle them. The catch is that they are heavy on the VRAM. You'll use at least a gig more VRAM at all times with virtual shadow maps enabled, which is why the note recommends them only for 10 gigabyte or higher graphics cards. The other main user of VRAM is going to be the texture quality setting. For that, you should just set texture quality to the highest your card can handle, but the textures aren't crazy impressive in this game, so if I had to pick between higher texture quality and virtual shadow maps, I would pick virtual shadow maps. If you're not sure what your card can handle, you can just open up Task Manager and look at the GPU section of the Performance tab to see what the dedicated memory usage looks like and try some things out. So that's shadows. Now we get to the indirect lighting settings, GI quality and lumen. I don't recommend lumen even at ultra GI quality. It's really noisy and distracting, in addition to being really expensive. Without lumen, changing the GI quality does change the appearance of indirect lighting, but since it's not in a way that actually looks consistently better or more stable, I think you should just set this at low and get some more performance, honestly. This is even more the case for reflections quality. Obviously, there aren't any water puddles or mirrors in the game, so this apparently only affects semi-reflective metallic objects. I couldn't find a good example of a surface where you can actually see the setting making a noticeable difference visually. From the description, I assume that when the global illumination system updates the indirect lighting in the environment, metallic objects are sampling that lighting and trying to create more accurate reflections that incorporate that dynamic light in the scene. So the reflections quality setting presumably increases the number of samples to make for a more accurate reflection. Now, there are enough metallic objects and enough indirect lighting for this to be making a measurable impact on performance, but in 60 hours of gameplay, my eyes just could not tell the difference, so I have this at low. I do not think it's worth the performance cost. I can't even tell you what you're getting for this besides, like a minus 4% to your frame rate. So unlike in most games, view distance has hardly any impact on performance. I'm guessing that's because they're using like nanite geometry for the terrain, so that streams in really efficiently, and it's just like the small rocks and grasses that pop in based on distance. So setting this higher doesn't really have any impact on performance, but it does reduce the pop-in of those small ground objects. It doesn't entirely eliminate them, but there's no reason not to have this at ultra, basically. The only thing I noticed post-processing affecting was the two things that are mentioned in this text. So higher settings, as I said before, decrease the graininess of motion blur if you have it enabled, and then it adds bloom to light sources. This setting makes hardly any visual difference and no performance difference, so you can just set it to whatever. Usually bloom sort of gives an impression of volumetric lighting in games that don't have them. This game does have real volumetric lighting, so the bloom effect is like really subtle. So again, you can just set this to whatever you want. The only thing you'll notice the effects setting doing is slightly improving the quality of sound clouds in the environment. So it's pretty subtle, but again, it's basically free performance-wise, so there's no reason not to have this at just the ultra setting. Texture quality we already discussed, just the highest your VRAM allows, while preferably still letting you use virtual shadow maps. And foliage quality is subjective. The note says moderate impact on GPU performance, but in my testing, it's a very small performance impact, less than 2%. This adds more small grasses on the ground around the bases of rock formations. On the one hand, this hides some of the tiling on sand textures, so having foliage quality higher can make the game look a little better. On the other hand, you're in the desert, so it seems more appropriate to have less foliage overall. Decorative grasses also look a lot like the fiber plants that you need to harvest for crafting, especially from a distance, so having more foliage can also just be annoying when you're trying to gather materials. So for those two reasons, I have it set to low. And that's it. So again, shadows are the biggest variable in terms of the visual quality and performance of the game. If you use virtual shadow maps, then you can actually set the quality setting to low and you'll get pretty good performance and pretty good looking shadows at the same time. If you can't use virtual shadow maps, then you're going to have to make a trade-off in terms of how good you want the shadows to be versus how you want the game to perform. Global illumination and reflections are notable performance-wise, and they're just definitely not worth their cost in my opinion, and nothing else really matters compared to those three settings. Depending on your system, you can play with the upscaler quality to fine-tune performance, and if you're constantly underperforming, you can consider enabling frame generation for a smoother experience. May your water be abundant.